At 5:58 a.m. on Christmas Eve, my 7-year-old handed me a note my parents left on the table. "We're off to Hawaii. Please move out before we're back." She thought she'd done something wrong. I hugged her, made breakfast, and quietly changed one thing on my phone. 2 hours later, my parents were panicking. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and I swear the universe has a sixth sense of timing because this happened at 5:58 a.m. on Christmas Eve, the hour when your brain is still booting up and your body thinks it's safe to be human for 5 more minutes, and then a tiny hand taps your shoulder like a warning light, and I cracked when I opened and saw my daughter Mia standing beside my bed in star-print pajamas, hair sticking out like she fought a pillow in her sleep and lost, her cheeks wet, her fists clenched around a folded piece of paper like it was radioactive, and the first thing my mind did was scan her for injury the way moms do without thinking, eyes racing for blood, for fever, for vomit, for the kind of panic that comes when a child's crying has no obvious source, and I whispered, "Mia, what's wrong?" And my voice sounded like gravel because I'd fallen asleep in my sweatpants with my phone still in my hand after wrapping gifts at midnight, and she didn't answer. She just held the paper out. With both hands, trembling so hard the page fluttered like a bird trapped in a room, and she sniffed. "I found it on the table." And that sentence alone made my stomach tighten because kids don't find things at dawn unless something has already been placed like a trap. So I took the paper carefully, the way you pick up a broken piece of glass when you already know it's going to cut you, and I unfolded it, and the handwriting was my mother's. Neat, controlled, the kind of handwriting people have when they think they're morally correct, and it said, "We're off to Hawaii. Please move out by the time we're back." And there was no "Merry Christmas," no love, no "call us," not even the fake friendliness people use when they're doing something cruel and want to feel civilized. Just that clean little sentence like an eviction notice dressed up as a vacation update. And for 1 second I stared at it waiting for my brain to go, "Just kidding," and it didn't, and Mia whispered, "Is Grandma mad at me?" And I felt something in my chest snap, because that is what cruelty does. It always travels downward. It always finds the smallest person in the house and sits on their lungs, and I forced my face into calm even though my heartbeat was suddenly loud in my ears, and I said, "No, baby, no. This isn't about you." And I meant it even if I didn't fully know it yet because I refused to let a 7-year-old carry adult ugliness like it's her backpack to school. And I slid out of bed and my feet hit the floor, and it was freezing, the kind of cold that makes you angry at the house itself, and I told Mia, "Stay right here, okay? I'm going to check something," and she nodded too fast, eyes wide, the way kids nod when they're trying to be good because they think being good will stop bad things, and I walked into the hallway, and the air felt empty, not quiet, empty, like the house had been stripped while I slept, and I headed toward the living room expecting at least some noise because my parents are not subtle people. My dad always clinks around like every cabinet is personally disrespecting him, but there was nothing, no TV murmuring, no kettle, no footsteps, and that's when my body started doing inventory without permission, like a detective in my own home, and I saw the coat hooks near the door were bare except for one lonely scarf. My mother's big travel tote that always sat by the entryway was gone. The suitcase wheels that usually thumped over the hardwood were silent, and I walked to the front window and looked out at the driveway and my parents' SUV wasn't there, and I stood staring at the empty space like the vehicle might appear if I concentrated hard enough. And that's when the reality landed, not a shock, but as a slow, heavy drop. They didn't write that note and then go to the grocery store. They left, they actually left, and they left the note for me to find like I'm a roommate who failed to pay rent. And the worst part, they left it on the table where my child would see it first, and I felt my jaw tighten so hard my teeth hurt. And I pulled my phone out and called my mother straight to voicemail, then my father voicemail, then my mother again because denial makes you stupid and hope makes you repeat things that have already hurt you, voicemail again. And I went back toward my bedroom, and Mia was still sitting on the edge of the mattress like she'd been glued there, her knees pulled up, her little hands tucked inside her sleeves. And she looked up at me like I might be able to reverse time if she asked nicely, and she whispered, "Are they here?" And I swallowed and said, "Not right now." And her face crumpled, and she tried to be quiet about it, like she didn't want to take up space with her sadness, and that destroyed me more than the note did, because children learn that kind of shrinking from adults who make them feel inconvenient. And I said, "Hey, come here." And I pulled her into my arms, and her body was warm and shaky, and she smelled like sleep and strawberry toothpaste, and she whispered, "Are we in trouble?" And I said, "No." Immediately, not even thinking, because I needed that word in the room like oxygen. And then she asked the question I was terrified of, "Are they kicking us out?" And my throat tightened, and I didn't lie exactly. I just softened it. I said, "Grown-ups are being weird, okay, but you and me were okay." And she clung to me like she believed I could hold the whole world together with my arms. And I kissed the top of her head and kept my voice steady like I was reading a bedtime story, and I said, "We're still doing Christmas," and she sniffed, "But Grandma's house," and I whispered, "I know," and I felt the note still in my hand like a dirty rag, and that's when my anger became clear, not explosive, clear, because this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a decision, and I needed to know who else knew. So I stepped into the hallway so Mia wouldn't hear the full conversation, and I called my younger sister Talia, and she answered on the second ring like she'd been awake all night scrolling through her own reflection, and she said, "Hello," in that bored voice she uses when she wants you to know you're interrupting her life. And I said, "Where are Mom and Dad?" And there was a pause just long enough to tell me she was choosing whether to play dumb, and then she sighed and said, "You found the note," like it was a weather update, and my stomach flipped, and I said, "You knew?" And she said, "Obviously." We all agreed, and I repeated, "We all agreed," because hearing it out loud makes it real, and she laughed a little and said, "Nora, you're 32. You can't live there forever." And I felt my fingers tighten on the phone, and I said, "I moved in to help." And she went, "Please," like my sentence was a joke, and she added, "It's embarrassing. You're a grown woman living with Mom and Dad." And I looked back at my bedroom door, and I could hear Mia's tiny sniffles, and I lowered my voice and said, "We were supposed to go together." And Talia's tone turned sugary, like she was explaining a policy, adults only. "We thought it would be better, and honestly, this gives you time to move out without drama while we're gone." And I felt my face go hot because it wasn't just betrayal, it was how proud she sounded of the cruelty, and I said, "Put Mom on." And I heard shuffling, and then my mother's voice came on, bright, decisive, like she was announcing a helpful update. "Nora," she said. "Hi." And I said, "Is this real?" And she made that annoyed exhale that means she thinks you're being difficult, and she said, "Talia explained it. We thought it would be best." And I said, "Best for who?" And she said quickly, "For everyone. You can move out without us in your way, peacefully, and we can have a proper trip." And I repeated, "A proper trip," because my brain couldn't accept the phrase, and she said, "Yes, a real adult's trip," like my existence had been childish clutter. And I said, "Mia found your note." And my mother softened her voice by exactly 2 degrees, the fake empathy setting, and she said, "Oh, she'll be fine. She's with you." And I felt something cold crawl up my spine because that's what people say when they don't care who gets hurt as long as it's not them. And I said, "We paid for the trip," and she answered too fast, rehearsed, "That's fine." We swapped the room. Talia's friend Marin wanted to come, and I blinked hard and said, "Marin," and she said warmly, "She's basically family." And I just stood there, staring at the wall, hearing the words basically family like a slap that echoes, and I said slowly, "So your daughter and your granddaughter aren't family, but Talia's friend is," and she snapped, "Don't say it like that." And I almost laughed because that sentence is what people say when they know it sounds evil and they want you to stop naming it. And I asked, "Where am I supposed to go?" And my sister's voice popped in on speaker, smug, "You'll figure it out. You're an adult." And my mother added, "You've had a cushy setup long enough." And that word, cushy, tasted bitter because I'd been paying my share and more, and I knew it, and they knew it, and they still said it like I'd been living there like a spoiled teenager, and I felt the moment inside me click into something calm and final, and I said, "Okay," not because I agreed, but because I was done giving them energy they didn't deserve, and I ended the call. And I stood there in the hallway with the phone in my hand and the note in the other, listening to my daughter sniffle behind the bedroom door, and I realized the most humiliating part was not the note. It was that they were doing this on Christmas Eve like it was a flex, like they wanted it to hurt extra, and I decided right then I was going to do two things: protect my child's heart and make sure the people who use me like a spare tire suddenly had to walk. And yes, I'm saying that like gossip because that's exactly what this is. It's family gossip, but with real consequences. So I need you to answer me honestly. If your parents left that note where your kid could find it, would you forgive it or would you go nuclear? Because I know what you're supposed to say. Take the high road. But the high road is usually just a fancy way of saying let them get away with it again. And I wasn't doing again anymore, and the first thing I did was go back into my room and kneel in front of Mia and hold her face gently in my hands so she'd look at me. And I said, "Listen, this is not because of you. You didn't do anything wrong, and I don't care what any grown-up says. You are wanted, you are loved, and you and me are a team." And she whispered, "Are we going to be homeless?" Because kids jump to the scariest picture they can imagine, and I felt my eyes sting, but I didn't let my voice shake. And I said, "No, baby, we're going to a safe place today, okay? And we're still doing Christmas, just ours." And she nodded like she wanted to believe me. And I took a breath and stood up and picked up my phone. Again, because emotions are real, but so are bank accounts, and I started with one simple action, the kind of action that looks small but changes everything. I opened my email and pulled up the Hawaii reservation, and I scrolled until I saw the payment details, my card on file, my name attached, because yes, I was on that trip financially even if they were trying to erase me socially, and I called my bank. And the woman on the phone sounded tired, like she'd already heard 50 holiday disasters. And I said, calmly, "I need to remove my card from a travel booking and dispute any unauthorized charges tied to it." And she asked a few questions and I answered like someone reading a grocery list, because when you get emotional, people use it against you. So I stayed calm, and within minutes the card was frozen. The dispute was initiated, and the booking could no longer keep sipping money from me like a straw. And when I hung up, I didn't feel guilty. I felt clean because adults pay for their own vacations, and if you're bold enough to abandon a child with a note, you're bold enough to fund your own paradise. And then I did the second thing, the one that mattered more, and before I say it, I want you to pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from, like actually drop your city and country in the comments. Because I need to know if this kind of family madness is universal, or if I just got drafted into a special kind of chaos. And while you're typing that, imagine being told you're cushy while your money is quietly keeping someone else's dream alive, because that's the part my family didn't expect me to understand. They thought I was just there like furniture, like a background character, but I knew exactly where my money went every month. And I knew because I had built the system myself. After my divorce, when I moved back in, it wasn't because I was broke. It was because I was convinced by the same old story I'd heard my whole life. We need help. You're strong. You're responsible. And my youngest sister Talia had gotten accepted into this expensive university out of state, and my parents wanted to protect her experience, which is their favorite word for "we'll sacrifice you so she doesn't feel discomfort." And I was offered the deal. Move in, save on rent, help cover her shortfall, and because I'm the one they trained to fix things, I agreed. And I co-signed a private student loan to cover part of her costs, and every month I logged into the portal and paid whatever the loan didn't cover, quietly, automatically, like a subscription to my own disrespect. And the cruel comedy is that after a few months they started calling me embarrassing for living there, while my money was literally holding up the story they bragged about at parties. Talia's at a great school, and nobody asked who was paying, because the family narrative always edits out the person being exploited. And standing there on Christmas Eve, watching my kid tremble, I realized I was done being edited out, so I opened the university payment portal right there in my bedroom, with Mia watching cartoons at low volume because I needed her to hear normal sounds in the house, and I went to the billing section and I found my card info and I removed it and it asked, "Are you sure?" And I clicked yes, and then I turned off autopay, and it gave me a little confirmation message like it was no big deal, and I set my phone down and stared at it for a second. Because the power of a few taps is terrifying when you realize you've been voluntarily carrying people for years, and I didn't call anyone. I didn't announce it because announcements are negotiations, and I wasn't negotiating. And then I moved into the practical part of survival. I called my friend Dana, the one mom friend who doesn't ask a million questions before she helps, and when she answered I said, "I need a Christmas rescue." And she didn't hesitate. She said, "Bring Mia, come now," and the relief hit me so fast I almost cried, because that's what real family sounds like. No lecture, no guilt, just come. And within an Hour I had Mia in the car with her little backpack and her teddy bear and a half-eaten candy cane she refused to throw away, and we drove through the cold, gray morning, and the streets were quiet in that holiday way, like the whole city was holding its breath, and Mia kept looking out the window and asking small, nervous questions like, "Are we still doing stockings?" And "Will Santa know where we are?" And I answered every one of them like I was building a bridge plank by plank. "Yes, we'll do. Stockings. Yes, Santa will know. Yes, we're safe." And when we arrived at Dana's house, the smell of cinnamon hit me the second the door opened, and her daughter Zoe threw herself at Mia like she'd been waiting all morning, and Mia's shoulders finally unclenched, and she laughed this tiny, surprised laugh, and that laugh made me so angry all over again because it proved how tense she'd been in my parents' house without even saying it. And while the girls disappeared into a pile of blankets and holiday movies, Dana pulled me into the kitchen and quietly said, "What happened?" And I held up the note and she read it and her mouth dropped open and she said, "That is insane." And I nodded and said, "Yep." And she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I already started." And I didn't explain everything, not yet, because it wasn't time for the emotional autopsy. It was time for action. And the rest of that day, I played normal for Mia. I made hot chocolate. I helped her build a gingerbread house that leaned like it was emotionally unstable. I laughed at Zoe's jokes. I let Mia fall asleep on Dana's couch with chocolate on her lip and her teddy bear under her arm. And when the house finally got quiet and the kids were down, I sat in Dana's guest room with my phone, and I did the next step. Housing, because my parents thought they'd given me time while they were gone. But what they actually gave me was a clean window to move without interference, and I searched rentals with one filter. Available now, not perfect, not Instagram, not look what I did after Betrayal. Just safe, clean, 2 bedrooms, and I found one that had been sitting empty for weeks, and I booked a viewing for the next morning, and as I lay there in Dana's spare bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the moral lesson in all this, the one nobody wants to hear until their own family does it to them. Love without accountability is just a leash, and people who benefit from your silence will call you dramatic the moment you speak. And the wildest part is my parents truly believed they were being kind by leaving when they did, like I should thank them for giving me a head start on my own displacement. And I kept thinking about Mia's voice. Is Grandma mad at me? And something in me hardened into a promise, because my daughter will not grow up believing she has to earn basic decency. And the next morning, while my family was probably boarding a plane in matching vacation outfits, I was standing in a small empty apartment that smelled like fresh paint and old carpet, holding Mia's hand, watching her run from room to room like it was an adventure, and she stopped in the second bedroom and whispered, "This could be mine." And I said, "Yes." And the landlord looked at me like he wasn't sure why I was so serious, and I handed him my paperwork like I'd been training for this moment my whole life. Steady job, pay stubs, references, and by afternoon I had keys in my palm. Cold and heavy, proof that I was no longer trapped inside someone else's mood swings. And that's when my phone buzzed, not a call, a notification, an email from the university billing system that I'd forgotten I had alerts for, and the subject line was polite but deadly. Payment method removed, action may be required. And I stared at that screen and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest, because I knew the clock had started, and the minute my sister tried to register for next semester, the system would scream, and my family would finally have to acknowledge the one truth they'd been dodging for years, that I wasn't just living in their house, I was funding their golden child's life, and the moment the money stopped, their family values would show their real face. And I'm telling you right now, what came next wasn't a calm conversation, it wasn't an apology, it wasn't even anger at first, it was panic. And they weren't panicking because they missed Mia. They weren't panicking because they cared if we were safe. They panicked because the bill came due and their favorite scapegoat had left the building. And when my phone lit up later that day with my mother's name, I didn't feel fear, I felt curiosity, because I knew exactly why she was calling, and I knew she was about to say something that would make it painfully clear that note was never about helping me grow up. It was about control. And now that control was slipping, they were about to do what people always do when their manipulation stops working. They were going to try a new mask, and I was ready to watch it fall. I answered on the third ring because I wanted to hear the tone first, not the words, and sure enough my mother didn't start with, "Where are you?" or "Is Mia okay?" She started with a kind of forced calm that means she's already angry but trying to sound righteous for the imaginary jury in her head. "Nora," she said, like my name was a bill she didn't recognize. "What did you do?" And I looked down at Mia sitting cross-legged on the new apartment floor, lining up crayons by color like she was organizing the world into something safe again, and I stepped into the tiny kitchen so she wouldn't hear my voice sharpen, and I said, "What did I do?" Because sometimes you have to make people say the ugly thing out loud, and my mother didn't hesitate. "The living room," she snapped. "The couch is gone, the chair is gone, the coffee table is gone. What is wrong with you?" And I actually blinked because the audacity was so pure it almost deserved framing, not because I was surprised she was mad, but because she was mad about furniture before she was concerned about a child, and that told me everything about what she valued. And I said, slow and clear, "Those were mine," and she made this offended little gasp like I'd slapped her with a receipt. "They were in our house," she said, and I could almost see her pointing at the empty space where my couch used to be like the absence was a crime scene, and I said, "Yes, my things were in your house, and now my things are in my house." And she raised her voice instantly. "You stole from us." And I laughed once, dry, not friendly, the kind of laugh that comes out when you realize someone truly believes their own lies, and I said, "Do you want me to text you the receipts while you call the police, or after?" And there was a beat of silence where she tried to decide if I was bluffing, and then she changed tracks because manipulation always has multiple doors. "We didn't mean for Mia to see the note," she said, suddenly soft, suddenly maternal, like she was auditioning for forgiveness, and I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides because that line right there is the one they always use. Not, "We shouldn't have done it," but "We shouldn't have gotten caught." And I said, "You left it on the table," and she sighed like I was being dramatic. "Nora," she said, "don't do this." And I said, "Don't do what?" "Tell the truth." And that's when she went cold again. "You're being petty," she snapped. "We're your parents." And I leaned my hip against the counter, staring at the blank white wall of my new kitchen, and I said, "You're adults who chose Hawaii over your daughter and granddaughter, and you put it in writing," and she tried to bulldoze right past it. "We're already back," she said. "We cut the trip short." And I almost choked because that was a lie with confidence, and I said, "You cut the trip short because the house was empty." And she paused, and that pause was delicious, because it meant she knew I was right. And then she did what she always does when she's cornered. She reached for the one weapon she thinks always works, the guilt-wrapped accusation. "So you're just going to tear this family apart." And I said, "You tore it apart at 5:58 a.m. on Christmas Eve." And I hung up before she could rewrite history again. Here's the thing people don't tell you about finally standing up for yourself. It's not cinematic at first, it's administrative. It's you doing paperwork while your heart is still bruised. It's you choosing not to be available for the next emotional ambush. It's you making your world smaller so it's safer, and I needed safe, because Mia was in that stage where she asked questions like they were pebbles she couldn't stop picking up. "Are Grandma and Grandpa coming here? Did I do something bad? Why are they mad?" And every time she asked, I had to answer with honesty that didn't traumatize her, which is a skill no one teaches you. So I told her the truth in child language. Sometimes grown-ups make selfish choices. Sometimes grown-ups mess up. Sometimes people act mean when they don't get their way. And she nodded like she understood. But I could see her eyes tracking my face like she was measuring whether I believed my own reassurance. And that's when it hit me that the real consequence of betrayal isn't the betrayal itself. It's the way it forces your child to become emotionally vigilant, and I hated my parents for that, not for the note, not for Hawaii, but for making my daughter feel like love can disappear overnight if you aren't useful enough. And I promised myself right there I was going to remove every adult from her life who treated her like an accessory. That promise got tested faster than I expected because an hour after I hung up on my mother, my phone lit up again, and this time it was my father, and I almost didn't answer because my dad is the kind of man who says very little, but somehow always benefits from the chaos he refuses to stop. The classic, I don't want to get involved guy who somehow ends up in charge of everything. But I answered because I wanted to hear if he had even one molecule of decency left, and he started with, "Nora," in this heavy, exhausted tone like I was the one who'd done something unreasonable, and then he said, "Your mother is upset." And I stared at my sink because I didn't trust my face not to twist into something ugly, and I said, "Is Mia upset too, Dad? Do you care?" And he sighed. And that sigh right there told me he was already preparing to excuse everything. And he said, "You know your mother." Like that was the end of the conversation. And I said, "I do, and that's the problem." And he cleared his throat and finally got to it. Talia's school called. And I felt this slow calm spread through me because I knew the domino had fallen. I knew it. And I said, "Did they?" And he said, "There's a payment issue." And I kept my voice flat. "There isn't a payment issue. There's a payment absence." And he paused. And then he said the sentence I swear should be printed on a warning label for grown daughters everywhere. "Can't you just fix it?" And I laughed. But this time it wasn't dry, it was sharp because the audacity hit again. And I said, "Fix it." And he said, "Just for now, just so she can register." And I said, "Dad, do you hear yourself?" And he tried to sound reasonable. "She's your sister." And I said, "And Mia is my daughter." And he went quiet like he didn't know what to do with that because my family is used to me making my own needs smaller. They're used to me treating my daughter like an extension of my inconvenience, and when I didn't, it broke their script. Then my sister Talia called, and let me tell you something, if entitlement had a ringtone, it would be my sister's number on my screen because she didn't start with hello, she started with accusation. "What did you do?" And her voice was shaking not with sadness but with rage, the kind of rage people get when the vending machine eats their money, like they genuinely believe the world owes them a refund. And I said, "Hi to you too." And she ignored it. "My account is on hold," she snapped. I can't register for next term. I got emails, I got a notice about the loan paperwork. What did you do?" And I didn't jump in to defend myself because defensive people lose, calm people win. So I let her talk until her breathing got ragged, and then I said, "I removed my card." And she went silent for half a second like her brain needed to reboot, and then she said, "You can't do that." And I said, "I already did." And she raised her voice, "You're sabotaging me because you're mad." And I said, "No, I'm opting out." And she actually scoffed like opting out was illegal. "You don't get to opt out," she said, and I said, "Watch me." And she started listing all the ways this would inconvenience her. "I have classes, I have housing, I have a schedule. I already told my friends I'm staying on campus." And it was like listening to someone describe their nails breaking during a house fire. And I said, "Talia, you called me a leech." And she snapped, "Because you are." And I felt my mouth go. Still, not hurt, just still, because it's one thing to suspect how someone sees you, it's another thing to hear it said with confidence. And I said, "Okay, then." And she said, "Okay, what?" And I said, "Then a leech doesn't pay your tuition anymore." And she sucked in a breath like I'd slapped her, and she tried to pivot. "Mom said you agreed." And I said, "I agreed when I lived in that house, and my child was treated like an inconvenience. And the deal ended when you decided to evict us by note." And she yelled, "We didn't evict you." And I said, "You did, you just used cute handwriting." And she tried the family loyalty angle, the one people love to use as a weapon. "You're supposed to help family." And I said, "Family doesn't leave notes where kids can find them." And she said, "It wasn't for her." And I said, "But it was seen by her and the damage was done." And she went quiet, and for 1 second, just one, her voice dropped, not angry, scared. "What am I supposed to do?" And that was the moment I almost softened, because I'm not a monster. I'm not wired to enjoy someone panicking. But then I remembered her laughter on the phone, her smug, "You're embarrassing," her casual cruelty like it was entertainment, and I realized the truth. She wasn't scared because she missed me. She was scared because her life might finally require effort, and I said, "Do what you told me to do." And she snapped, "What?" And I said, "Be an adult, figure it out." And she went silent like she couldn't compute those words being used on her. Now let me gossip with you for a second because this is the part that makes people in the comments start throwing punches at each other. Some of you are going to say, "But she's your sister. Don't ruin her future." And I need you to hear me clearly. I didn't ruin anything. I stopped being the secret sponsor of someone who disrespected me. There's a difference, and I want you to think of it like this. Trust is a contract. And my family broke the contract and still expected me to keep making payments like nothing happened, and love is supposed to be a safety net, right? But my parents turned it into a trapdoor, and my sister treated my help like her birthright. And if you've ever been in that role, the helper who gets blamed the second you stop helping, you already know the punchline. The second you set a boundary, they call you selfish, dramatic, bitter, ungrateful, like boundaries are insults. Anyway, after I ended that call, the real show started because within 24 hours my mother tried a different mask, the sweet mask, and she texted me a photo like she thought nostalgia would work, an old picture of me as a kid holding my dad's hand at the zoo, and underneath she wrote, "Remember when you loved us?" And I stared at the screen so long my eyes went dry because that is not a message, that is a weapon. And I didn't reply because I don't negotiate with guilt anymore. Then the next morning, I heard a knock at my door that wasn't a polite neighbor knock. It was that sharp, confident knock of people who think they have authority over you, and my stomach tightened, and I looked through the peephole, and there they were, my mother, my father, and Talia, lined up in the hallway like a little team, dressed like they'd rehearsed being reasonable on the drive over. And my mother's mouth was already in that tight smile she uses when she's about to perform kindness. And I didn't open the door because my child was in the living room, and I didn't want her to see their faces and start thinking she needed to beg for love again, so I spoke through the door. "What?" And my mother's voice went syrupy. "Nora, honey, we just want to talk." And I said, "No." And she laughed softly like I was joking. "Please." And my father cleared his throat. "Just listen." And Talia snapped, "This isn't funny." And I almost laughed because it was funny in the bleak way, like watching people who never respected you suddenly act polite because they need something. My mother tried the group tactic, "We're family," and I said, "Family left a note." And she sighed like I was exhausting. "You're exaggerating." And I said, "My kid cried in the dark at 6 a.m. That's not exaggeration." And there was a pause, and then the real reason slid out. My father said quietly, "We can't co-sign," and my mother jumped in fast. "Our credit isn't where it needs to be," and Talia cut in. "So just sign it." And my mother's voice got sharper. "We're asking you to do the right thing." And I leaned my forehead against the door for half a second because I could feel my pulse in my temples, and I said, "The right thing." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "The right thing would have been not abandoning a child emotionally on Christmas Eve." And she snapped, "Stop bringing that up." And I said, "I will never stop bringing it up because you want to erase it." And she hissed, "You're punishing us." And I said, "No, I'm protecting Mia." And my father said, "You're making it worse." And I said, "It was already worse. You just didn't care because you weren't the one paying." Then I did something I didn't expect to do, something that felt like a power move and also like grief. I opened the door just enough to step into the hallway so they could see I wasn't afraid. I just wasn't available, and I kept my voice low so it wouldn't carry back into my apartment. And I said, "You will not come inside, you will not see my daughter, and you will not ask me for money again." And my mother's eyes widened like I'd slapped her, and Talia's mouth dropped open because she had never seen me say no like that, and my father looked tired, like he wanted to disappear, and my mother tried to bargain. "Let's not be extreme." And I said, "Extreme is leaving a note." And Talia snapped, "You're ruining my life." And I looked straight at her and said, "No, I'm refusing to run it." And that line made her flinch because it was true, and it was the first time anyone had told her she wasn't entitled to my labor. My mother tried one last tactic, the victim tactic. Her voice started wobbling like she was about to cry. "After everything we've done for you." And I felt my stomach twist because that sentence is designed to make you forget the facts. So I didn't let it. I said, "You mean after everything I did for you?" And she blinked, and I kept going, calm and deadly. "I paid bills, I furnished your living room, I co-signed loans, I covered shortfalls, and in return you called me embarrassing and left a note." And my father murmured, "That's not fair." And I said, "Fairness hasn't been your family brand in years." And then I pointed down the hallway. "Leave." And my mother's face hardened like stone, and she hissed something under her breath I won't repeat because I don't need Mia hearing those kinds of words in her world. And my father turned first, and Talia stared at me like she was waiting for me to crack, waiting for the old me to show up and apologize for having boundaries. And when I didn't, she finally followed them to the elevator, and the hallway went quiet again. I locked my door and stood there for a second, breathing, not shaking, just breathing. And when I turned around, Mia was at the table drawing, humming softly, completely unaware of the adult circus that had just tried to march into her life again. And I realized something that might be the only useful lesson in this entire mess, the kind of lesson I wish someone had drilled into my skull at 20. You can't build a peaceful life while keeping open access to people who profit from your chaos. You just can't. And if you're listening to me right now and you've got family members who only show up when they need a signature, a payment, a favor, I want you to ask yourself one uncomfortable question. If you stop helping tomorrow, would they still love you, or would they only love the role you play? That night I tucked Mia into bed in her new room, her little nightlight casting stars on the ceiling, and she whispered, "Are they going to be mad forever?" And I brushed her hair back and said, "They can feel whatever they want, but we're safe." And she whispered, "Do I still get to love them?" And that question hit me like a punch because kids love even the people who hurt them. They just do. And I said, "You can love them. And you can also have boundaries." And she didn't fully understand. But she nodded anyway. And when she fell asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my phone because I knew this wasn't over. People like my mother don't accept boundaries, they look for loopholes, and people like my sister don't accept consequences, they look for new victims, and my father looks for the easiest path, which usually means he lets the loudest woman in the room decide what reality is. And that's when my phone buzzed with an email I wasn't expecting, not from the school, not from my bank, but from our mortgage company, and the subject line was so harmless it almost made me laugh. Action required. Cosigner review. And my stomach dropped because I suddenly remembered the one favor I'd done years ago when I still thought helping family was the same thing as being loved. The house, the mortgage, the paperwork with my name on it. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a tuition problem, it was a control problem, and they had one more lever they could pull, and judging by that email, they were already pulling it. The email sat there glowing like a quiet threat. Action required. Cosigner review. And the first thing I felt wasn't panic, it was that slow, cold anger you get when you realize someone has been saving a weapon for later, and you just walked into the room where they keep it, because I hadn't thought about that mortgage in years. Not since I signed it in that cramped bank office with the fake plant in the corner, and the smell of printer toner in the air, back when my parents still knew how to act grateful for 5 full minutes before turning it into entitlement. And I remember exactly how it happened because moments like that brand themselves into your brain. My dad called me on a Tuesday after work when I still believed family meant we take care of each other, and he sounded unusually gentle, like he was trying to pet a stray animal without getting bitten. "Nora," he said, "we need a small favor." And I was washing dishes in my old apartment. Mia was 2 at the time, sitting in a high chair smearing mashed banana onto her tray like she was painting, and I said, "What kind of favor?" And he cleared his throat and said, "Just a signature, that's all." And my mother got on the line immediately with her bright voice, the one she uses when she's selling you something and wants you to think you thought of it first. "Sweetie, it's nothing," she said. "We're refinancing the house to get a better rate. It helps everybody." And I asked the obvious question, "Why do you need me?" And my mother laughed like I was silly. "Because the bank likes more stability," she said. "You have good credit, you're responsible, it's just paperwork." And the word responsible hit my ears like a compliment back then instead of what it really was, a label they used so they could lean on me harder. And I remember hesitating because I was newly divorced and finally tasting peace. And any time they asked for something, I could feel the old role trying to snap back onto me like a collar. But my dad said, "It protects the family home." And my mother said, "It's for Mia too. She loves this house." And it was such a clean little manipulation. Wrap the ask in the child. Make the mother feel guilty for being cautious, and I fell for it because I didn't want to be the daughter who said no to the family home. I didn't want to be the one who overreacted. So I went. I drove there after putting Mia to bed. I sat in that office while a loan officer slid papers at me like a magician doing a trick, and I asked, "What's my risk?" And my mother laughed again. "Oh my God, you're so dramatic, we pay our bills." And the loan officer did that professional smile that means I cannot advise you, but I'm watching you. And I signed anyway because the sentence, "It's just a signature," is basically a spell. It makes smart people do stupid things. Now, years later, with Mia sleeping in the next room and my parents already showing me exactly how disposable we were, that email felt like a trapdoor opening under my feet. So I didn't ignore it, and I didn't call my parents first. I did the thing I wish more people did before they let guilt talk them into financial suicide. I called the lender directly. And the woman who answered had that calm customer service voice that could be comforting or terrifying depending on the day. "Thank you for calling. Can I have your account number?" And I said, "I'm a co-signer. I received an action required notice. I need to understand exactly what is being requested and what my exposure is." and I could hear her typing click, 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 like my life was being pulled up on a screen, and she said, "One moment," and the whole music started, cheerful little piano notes like the universe's jokes. And I stood there in my socks staring at my refrigerator magnets because my hands needed something ordinary to look at while my brain ran worst-case scenarios, and then she came back and said, "Okay, I see the file." And my stomach tightened. "Your parents initiated a refinance application and requested removal of a co-signer." And I actually let out a breath I didn't know I was holding because removal meant they were trying to get me off, which sounded good. But then she added, "However, the application indicates they do not currently qualify for the refinance without the co-signer, so the lender is requesting either updated financial documentation or a renewed co-signer consent." And there it was, the real ask, dressed up in bank language. They wanted my name again. They wanted my signature again. And I said, "So to be clear, if I do nothing, what happens?" And she said, "Then the refinance cannot proceed." And I said, "And the current mortgage remains unchanged." And she said, "Correct. Payments continue under the current agreement." And I felt that cold anger again because I could already predict my mother's next performance. She was going to act like the refinance was an emergency, like not refinancing would force them into hardship, and she was going to blame me for consequences that came from their own choices. I thanked the woman, hung up, and sat down at my kitchen table without even realizing I'd moved, because my legs suddenly felt like they belonged to someone older, someone tired, and I stared at my phone and waited, because when you cut off the money pipeline, people don't ask nicely, they escalate, and right on schedule my phone buzzed with my mother's name like a jump scare, and I didn't answer immediately. I watched it ring, because I wanted to feel my own control, and when I finally picked up, I kept my voice soft and neutral, the way you talk to a person holding a lit match near gasoline. "Hello," and she didn't even pretend to warm up. "Did you get an email?" she demanded, and I said, "Yes," and she exhaled hard like she was already annoyed I hadn't handled it for her. "Okay, good," she said. "We just need you to sign something, it's quick." And I said, "No." And there was a silence, so sharp I could practically hear her jaw lock. Then she did the thing she always does when she hears a boundary. She tried to turn it into a misunderstanding. "Know what?" she said, like I'd spoken another language, and I said, "I'm not signing anything." And she let out this small laugh, like she was trying to shame me back into compliance. "Nora, don't be ridiculous." And I said, "I'm not." And she went straight to outrage. "So you're going to let us lose the house?" And there it was, the dramatic guilt hook. The one designed to make me picture my parents homeless on the street like cartoon characters, and my old self would have folded right there, but my new self had Mia's shaking hands burned into it, so I stayed steady and said, "The refinance is optional." And she snapped, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "I spoke to the lender." And that sentence made her stutter for half a second because it meant I'd stepped outside her narrative. And she recovered fast. "They don't understand our situation," she said, and I said, "They understand numbers." And she hissed, "You're doing this to punish us." And I said, "No, I'm doing this to protect me and Mia." And she changed tactics again, faster this time, from rage to sweetness like flipping channels. "Sweetie," she cooed, "we're family, you don't abandon family." And I laughed softly because the hypocrisy was almost art, and I said, "You abandoned us with a note." And she snapped, "Stop bringing up that note." And I said, "You want me to stop because you want the benefit without the accountability." And she went quiet, then she lowered her voice into something darker. "You're being influenced," she said, and I knew exactly what she meant without her naming it. She meant my friend, my support system, any person who isn't her. Because people like my mother can't imagine a grown woman making decisions unless someone else is controlling her. "No," I said, "I'm being awake." And she went venomous. "You think you're so smart." And I said, "I think I'm done." And she spat, "So you're choosing to destroy this family." And I said, "I'm choosing to stop being the family's credit card." And then I heard movement on her side, like she was handing the phone off, and my dad's voice came on, quiet and tired. "Nora," he said, and I felt that familiar twist, because even after everything, a part of me still wanted my dad to be the good guy, the reasonable one, the one who might finally say, "Your mother went too far." But he didn't. He said, "We need your help." And I said, "You needed my help when Mia was crying." And he inhaled, That note was your mother's idea, he said quickly, like that absolved him, and I said, and you let it happen. And he went silent because that's the part he never has an answer for, and then he tried his favorite move, the minimizing. It's just a signature, he said, and I felt my grip tighten on the phone, and I said, that sentence has cost me years. And he sighed, you're overreacting. And I said, Dad, if you miss a payment, it hits my credit. If something goes wrong, I'm attached, and I will not tie my child's future to your choices. And he said, we raised you. And I said, and I raised myself emotionally in that house. And he tried again. You don't understand how hard it is right now. And I said, I understand exactly how hard it is right now. I'm a single mom building a new life after being thrown out. And that's when my sister Talia's voice cut in, sharp and impatient. Oh my God, this again, she said, like my child's pain was a boring story she'd heard too many times. Just sign it, you're being petty. And I felt something in me go so calm it was scary, and I said, Talia, you lost the right to call me petty when you watched Mom and Dad leave a note for a 7-year-old. And she scoffed, she'll survive. And I said, so will you? And then I hung up because I was done letting them ping-pong me between guilt and rage. After that call, I didn't pace the apartment like a frantic person. I didn't cry in the bathroom. I didn't do the dramatic thing my mother loves to accuse me of. I sat down and made a list, because this is the part people skip in stories, but it's the part that actually saves your life. The practical steps, the boundaries with teeth. I opened a notes app and wrote in plain language what I would and would not do. I will not co-sign anything. I will not give them access to Mia. I will not answer calls after 7 p.m. I will not engage with insults. I will document everything. And then I did something that felt petty and grown up at the same time. I started a folder in my email called Receipts, and I forwarded every message, every note, every nasty little text into it, because when people are used to controlling you, they often try to rewrite reality later. And I wanted reality in writing. The next day, my mother tried the drop-by strategy again. Except this time she came alone, and it was almost funny how strategic it was, because she knows my dad's presence makes me soften and my sister's presence makes me defensive, but her alone makes me want to fix things. So she showed up with a bag in her hand like she was bringing peace offerings, and she knocked in that gentle rhythm like she was a normal mother. And I didn't open the door, and she said through it, Nora, I brought Mia a little gift, and my stomach flipped because that's the hook. Use the child. Always use the child. And I said, leave it at the door. And she said, I want to see her. And I said, no. And she sighed dramatically, this is cruel. And I said, what's cruel is trying to buy access to a child after you made her feel unwanted. And she went quiet, and then she did something I didn't expect. She started crying, real sobbing sounds. And for 1 second my old self surged forward like muscle memory, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the maybe if I just talked to her version of me. And then I remembered the note again. I remembered Mia's shaky fingers, and I remembered that my mother cried plenty when it benefited her, so I stayed where I was and said, stop, and she sniffed. I didn't mean it like that. And I said, meaning doesn't erase impact. And she whispered, you're punishing me. And I said, I'm protecting my daughter. And she tried again, voice small, she misses us. And I said, she misses the idea of grandparents, not the reality you gave her. And my mother's tone hardened instantly because the softness wasn't getting her what she wanted. You're turning her against us, she hissed, and I said, no, you did that yourself. And she slammed her hand against the door, not hard enough to break anything, just hard enough to intimidate, and that told me everything about her emotional range, sweet or threatening, nothing in between. And she said, if you don't sign, we're going to lose everything. And I said, then you should have thought of that before you treated me like disposable. And she spat, you always hold grudges. And I said, this isn't a grudge, this is a boundary. And then she did the one thing that made my blood run cold. She said, Mia wouldn't want you to be the reason Grandma loses her home. And it was so low, so manipulative, using my child as a moral hostage, that my hands actually started shaking, not from fear, from disgust. And I said, slowly, so she could hear every word, do not put my child's name in your mouth like that. And there was a pause, and then she whispered, so that's it. And I said, that's it. And she walked away, and I watched through the peephole as she picked up the gift bag like it was never for Mia in the first place and carried it back down the hall. When I turned around, Mia was standing there, quiet as a shadow, and my chest tightened because I hadn't heard her come up, and she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Was that Grandma?" And I crouched down so I was eye level with her, and I said, "Yes," and she whispered, "Is she mad?" And I felt my throat burn because this is what manipulation does. It teaches a child to take responsibility for adult emotions, and I said, "Her feelings are not your job." And Mia blinked like that was a new concept, and she said, "But if she's sad," and I put my hands on her shoulders gently and said, "Listen to me, Mia. Grown-ups are responsible for their own choices. You are not in charge of fixing anybody." And she looked like she wanted to believe me but wasn't sure she was allowed to, and that's when I realized my parents had already started the next phase. They weren't just trying to get my signature, they were trying to get back inside my daughter's head because if they could make her feel guilty, they could get to me through her. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was scared of them showing up, but because my mind kept running through all the little ways people like my parents escalate when they don't get what they want. They call extended family, they spread narratives, they play victim, they show up at schools, they use paperwork. And I kept thinking about that refinance application and how it said they wanted to remove me as co-signer, but didn't qualify without me, which meant they were already underwater financially, and people who are underwater don't fight fair. And right as I was drifting off, my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number, a text that made my stomach drop so hard it felt like falling. "You think you can ruin us and walk away?" It said, "We'll make sure everyone knows what kind of daughter you are." And I stared at the screen in the dark, the light painting my hands ghost white. And my first thought was not about me, it was about Mia, because the second people start making threats, even vague ones, you stop playing it casual, you start planning like a mother, and I typed 3 words back, calm and surgical, "Do not contact." And then I took screenshots, saved them, and opened my receipts folder because something was coming next, something bigger than guilt and doorstep tears, and I needed to be ready. And as I set my phone down, I realized the real twist wasn't the refinance or the tuition or the furniture. The twist was that my parents didn't just want money, they wanted control. And when control doesn't work, people like them reach for the one thing they think can force you back into line, humiliation, and judging by that message, they were about to go loud. The next morning my phone was already vibrating like a trapped insect before my eyes even opened, and I swear I knew it was going to be one of those days where you don't get to choose your mood. Your mood gets assigned to you by other people's audacity, so I did the mom thing first. I slid out of bed quietly, checked on Mia, watched her chest rise and fall, her hair spread across the pillow like a little dark halo. And I stood there for a second longer than normal, because a sleeping child looks like peace you can physically see, and I needed to memorize that peace before I walked back into the mess. Then I picked up my phone, and there were 17 notifications, not the normal mix of school reminders and grocery coupons, but a pile of messages from numbers I hadn't saved, cousins I barely spoke to, a church lady who once told me my skirt was a little bold for a mother. And the family group chat I had muted for my sanity was suddenly lighting up like a crime scene, and the first message I saw was from my Aunt Ruth. "Nora, call your mother immediately. You're breaking her heart." And I didn't even have time to process that because right under it was a screenshot someone had posted, a Facebook status for my mother, public, not friends only, public, with that syrupy victim voice she reserves for performance. It's heartbreaking when your own child turns against you after everything you've done for her. And then a second line. "Pray for us. We are being financially abused." And when I tell you my stomach flipped, I mean my body actually reacted like it had been hit, because the term financial abuse coming from the woman who left a move-out note for my child to find is not just hypocrisy, it's psychological vandalism. It's her trying to rewrite the entire truth into something where she's the injured party and I'm the villain, and I stared at the screen like, wow, this woman really woke up and chose delusion with Wi-Fi. I clicked the post even though I knew I shouldn't, because curiosity is a disease and I was infected, and the comments were already full of people doing that performative pity. "Oh, sweet Pamela, you're such a good mom. Some children are ungrateful. Family is family no matter what." And my personal favorite, "Maybe the devil is influencing her." Like, yes, Janet. The devil made me cancel my credit card and stop paying for a grown adult's tuition. He also made me buy oat milk and keep receipts. Truly demonic. And then I saw the comment that made my hands go cold. It was from my sister Talia's best friend Kendra, the one who never liked me because I wasn't impressed by her lashes. I heard she's keeping the granddaughter away too, so sad. And the way they used the word granddaughter like Mia was a possession made my chest tighten, because I could already feel where this was going. They weren't going to stop at shaming me. They were going to try to make me look dangerous, because mean daughter doesn't force compliance, but unfit mother can. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have 1,000 things to say, but because I've learned the hard way that arguing in public with a person who lies for sport is like wrestling a pig. You both get dirty and the pig enjoys it. So instead I took screenshots. All of it, the post, the comments, the timestamps, and I saved them in that receipts folder like I was building a case because I was. Then I made breakfast like nothing was happening because that's the part nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't pause your responsibilities, it just stacks itself on top. So I made Mia oatmeal, I cut a banana into little coins, I packed her lunch, and while she ate she told me about a dream where her teacher turned into a unicorn, and I laughed in the right places while my mind was elsewhere like a split screen. One side motherhood. One side war room. When we got to school, the air was cold and sharp, and the drop-off line moved slow, and I remember noticing ridiculous details like the way the crossing guard's gloves were too big, the way a dad in front of me kept tapping his steering wheel like he was impatient at life, and Mia leaned forward to look out the window and said, "Are we seeing Grandma today?" And I kept my eyes on the road and said gently, "No, baby, not today." And she went quiet in a way that made me want to reach back and hug her, but I couldn't because my hands were on the wheel and my heart was trying not to break in traffic. I walked her to the gate, kissed her forehead, watched her little backpack bounce as she ran toward her classroom, and right before she disappeared inside, she turned back and gave me that small wave, the one kids do when they still believe adults can fix everything, and I waved back smiling like I wasn't terrified of the next phone call. It came before I even got to my car. "Miss Hart," a voice said behind me, and I turned and saw the school secretary, Dana, holding a clipboard like it was heavy, and I knew Dana. She'd always been friendly, always called Mia Little Sunshine, but today her face was careful, professional, guarded, and she said, "Can you step inside for a second?" And I felt my blood pressure climb because no parent likes being asked to step inside like they've been caught. And I followed her into the office, and it smelled like coffee and copy paper. And that weird lemon cleaner they use, and Dana shut the door halfway and lowered her voice. "We received a call this morning," she said, and I didn't speak, because I already knew, and she continued. "A woman identifying herself as Mia's grandmother," and my stomach dropped, and she said there's a family dispute, and she may need to pick Mia up today. And I felt this flash of rage, so hot it was almost clean, because my mother didn't even waste time. She went straight for my child's schedule like it was leverage, and I said calmly, "She is not authorized," and Dana nodded quickly. "I know, I checked the file. Only you are listed," and I exhaled a fraction, but Dana wasn't done. She looked uncomfortable and said, "She also implied that you might be unstable." And I actually laughed once, a short, sharp laugh that scared even me, because of course she did. Of course that's the narrative. If you won't be controlled financially, they'll try to control your reputation. And I said, "Did she give any reason?" And Dana hesitated. She said, "You're withholding Mia and you're making threats." And my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. And I said, "I have documentation." And Dana held up her hand slightly. "I'm not accusing you. I just needed to tell you." And I nodded, and I forced my voice into steady adult mode. "Thank you for telling me. Please add a note to Mia's file that no one is permitted to pick her up except me, and if anyone calls again, please document the phone number and exactly what they say." And Dana's eyes widened a little, like she didn't expect me to speak like someone who had done this before, and I hated that. I hated that this situation was turning me into a person who thinks in protocols and documentation instead of joy. But that's what people do to you. They steal your softness and replace it with systems. I walked back to my car and sat there gripping the steering wheel, and I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, the messy bun, the tired eyes, the face of a woman who just wants peace, and I whispered to myself, "Okay, Nora, stay smart, because anger is powerful but strategy is what wins." I drove home, and on the way my phone rang again, unknown number, and I didn't answer, and it immediately went to voicemail, and then it rang again and again and again, and I finally answered on the 5th call with my voice on ice. "Hello?" And my mother said, "So you want to embarrass us? like that was the opening line of a normal conversation, and I said, "Stop calling me a school," and she gasped, fake shocked. "How dare you accuse me?" And I said, "The school told me." And she paused, and I could hear her recalibrate, and then she went into that wounded mother script. "I'm just concerned," she said. "You're acting irrational and you're keeping my granddaughter from me." And I said, "You left a note where she could find it." And my mother snapped, "That note was for you." And I said, "You didn't care who read it." And she hissed, "You're twisting everything." And I said, "No, I'm naming it." And then she dropped her voice like a threat wrapped in velvet. "People are asking questions, Nora," she said. "They're wondering why you're doing this." And I said, "Let them wonder." And she said, "Maybe they should know the truth about you." And I felt my pulse in my throat, and I said, "Is that a threat?" And she did that little sigh, the one she uses when she wants to sound reasonable while saying something evil. "It's a reality," she said. "You can't treat family like this and expect no consequences." And I said, "Consequences is exactly what you're experiencing." And she screamed, "We could lose the house." And I said, "That's not my responsibility." And she said, "You're doing this because you're jealous of your sister." And I said, "I'm doing this because you tried to throw me and my child out like trash." And then she went quiet. And when my mother goes quiet, it's never because she's reflecting. It's because she's choosing the next weapon. And she said, "Fine," softly. "If you want war, we can do war." And then she hung up. And I sat there for a second like, did she really just say that? Did my mother just declare war on her own daughter over a signature? And that's when it hit me. This isn't about the refinance. It's not even about the tuition. Those are symptoms. The real disease is entitlement, because people who feel entitled to you will punish you for acting like you belong to yourself. I didn't spiral. I got up and I did the next practical thing. I called a lawyer, not because I wanted drama, but because I wanted protection, and the receptionist asked me a few questions and then scheduled a consult. And when I finally talked to the attorney, she was blunt in a way I loved. She said, "You need to keep communication in writing, you need to document attempts to contact the child, and you need to inform the school in writing as well." And I said, "What about the mortgage?" And she said, "Do not sign anything, and request in writing that the lender remove you if possible, but understand removal depends on their qualification." And then she asked me something that stuck in my ribs. "Has anyone threatened to report you to child services?" And I paused, because my mother hadn't said it directly, but she was circling it like a shark. And I said, "Not yet." And the lawyer said, "Assume it's coming." And that sentence made my skin go cold, because it put words to the thing I hadn't wanted to admit. They were going to try to take my child away emotionally if they couldn't access her physically, and if that didn't work, they might try to scare me with authorities. After the call, I opened my laptop, wrote an email to the school with clear instructions. No one is authorized to pick up Mia. Any attempted contact should be documented. And I attached a photo of my mother and father from their own Facebook page, because if they showed up, I wanted no confusion. Then I took another breath, and I did something I never thought I'd do. I blocked my mother's number, and I know that sounds small, but if you've ever been raised to believe access equals love, blocking feels like committing a crime, and my hands shook as I pressed it, not because it was wrong, but because it was new. Then, like the universe was watching and wanted to test my resolve, my doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent ring, and through the peephole I saw Kendra, my sister's best friend, standing there in a coat that looked expensive and a face that looked smug. And I didn't open the door, and she called through it, "Nora, I just want to talk." And I actually smiled to myself, because this is the pattern. They send intermediaries to make you look unreasonable. "Look, I know you're upset," Kendra said, "but you're going too far." And I said through the door, "Leave." And she laughed like I was dramatic. "You're really doing the most." And I said, "You are on my property, leave." And then her voice got sharper. "Do you know what people are saying about you?" And I said, "I don't care." And she said, "You should." And she lowered her voice like she was delivering a secret. "They're saying you're unstable. They're saying you're using Mia to punish your parents." And I felt that rage flare again. Because it's always the same accusation. Mothers only ever protect their kids because they're bitter, never because they're right. And I said, "Get off my doorstep." And she hissed, "You know what, fine, but don't act surprised when this comes back on you." And then she walked away, and I watched her go from the window like she was a messenger from a toxic kingdom. I stood there in the quiet, and my body finally let the fear surface. because the hard part about family betrayal isn't the first punch, it's the way it makes you question your own reality. It makes you wonder if everyone will believe them. It makes you wonder if you're the crazy one because they're so confident. And I want you to tell me honestly, if your parents went online and painted you as the villain, would you defend yourself publicly or stay silent and build your case quietly? Because I was standing right there with that question in my throat, and I chose the second option, not because I'm weak, but because I've learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most truthful. They're just the most practiced. That afternoon, my phone got a notification from the lender again, another action required. But this one had a different tone. It said delinquency risk review. And my heart dropped because that meant they weren't just trying to refinance. They were already behind or about to be, and I clicked it and saw the numbers, the missed payment date, the late fee, the projected adjustment, and I sat there thinking, so this is why they're panicking. This is why the smear campaign started so fast. Because if they can't force me to sign, they need to force me to feel guilty enough to rescue them. And my mind went straight to the worst thought, the juicy, neurotic thought I didn't want to admit. What if they intentionally stopped paying to hurt my credit? What if they'd rather burn me than face consequences? And that's when I realized my mother's war comment wasn't dramatic, it was a plan. So I did the next smallest smart step. I called the lender again and asked a direct question. If the primary borrowers become delinquent, will you notify the cosigner immediately? And the woman said yes, and I said, I want all notifications in writing and I want the address on file updated to my current address. And then I asked, is there any way to remove myself without a refinance? And she said no. And I thanked her anyway, and when I hung up I felt that weird mix of helpless and powerful. Helpless because a signature from years ago still had a shadow over my life. Powerful because I was finally seeing the game clearly. Then I picked up Mia from school, and she ran into my arms like everything was normal, and for a second I let myself pretend it was. She talked about spelling words and a classmate who ate glue, and I laughed. And then as we walked to the car, she said, Mommy, Dana said my grandma called. And my throat tightened, and I crouched down and said, did Dana say anything else? And Mia shook her head. Just that I'm safe. And I swallowed hard and said, you're safe. And she looked at me and said, are we in trouble? And I held her face gently and said, no, baby. You are never in trouble for being loved by me. And she blinked and nodded like she was filing that away as a new rule. That night after she fell asleep, my phone buzzed with a message from my Aunt Ruth again. Except this time it was a screenshot of something else my mother posted, a second status, even more dramatic. Some daughters will leave their parents homeless and sleep peacefully. And under it my mother had tagged my name, tagged me, like she wanted it to show up on my page and stain me, and I stared at it and felt my hands go cold, because now it wasn't whispers, it was public targeting, and if she was willing to tag me, she was willing to escalate further. And I opened my laptop and started drafting a single message, not an argument, not a rant, a calm statement with boundaries and facts. And as I typed, I realized the real question wasn't whether I could survive my mother's smear campaign. The real question was what she would do when she realized shame wasn't working, because people like her don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when they lose leverage, and I could feel it coming. The next move, the one that would cross from gossip into something that could actually threaten Mia's stability. And the terrifying part is I didn't know if it would come through a phone call, a knock on the door, or a letter with an official logo on it. But I knew one thing for sure. My mother had declared war, and she was about to prove what war meant. Always, please don't let us feel consequences. And I said slowly, clearly, so there would be no confusion to twist later, I am not signing anything. And my mother's voice snapped sharp like a rubber band. You're being vindictive. And I said, no, I'm being consistent. And my father jumped in fast. This could ruin us. And I said, you ruined yourselves when you decided my stability was expendable. And then my mother said the sentence that confirmed everything I already knew. After everything we've done for you. And I felt this strange calm wash over me, because that sentence is the anthem of every manipulator who thinks generosity is a leash. And I said, list it. And there was a pause, and she said, what? And I said, list what you've done for me that didn't come with a condition. And she went quiet, not angry quiet, empty quiet, because people like her don't keep score that way. They just expect the balance to always favor them. Then she tried a new tactic, the one that sounds loving but is actually poison. "We're worried about Mia," she said softly, and my stomach flipped, because there it was again. "My child is leverage," and I said, "Explain." And she said, "This instability isn't good for her." And I laughed once, dry and humorless. "The instability started when you left a move-out note where she could find it." And my dad muttered, "That was a mistake." And I said, "So is threatening her mother." And my mother raised her voice. "We are not threatening anyone." And I said, "You called her school, you called my job, you are posting about me publicly, that is a threat." And she snapped, "You're overreacting." And I felt that old reflex flare, the one where I want to explain myself into exhaustion, but I stopped at mid-breath because explaining is a trap, and I said, "This conversation is over." And I hung up before they could pull me back in. I sat there for a second staring at my phone like it might ring again, and then I did something that felt small but was actually huge. I wrote a cease and desist letter draft, not sent yet, just drafted, with the help of a template my lawyer had emailed me earlier, and reading those words, "Any further attempts to contact my minor child or interfere with my employment will result in legal action," made my hands shake. Not because I was scared, but because it felt like stepping into a version of myself my family never prepared for, the version that doesn't ask permission to be safe. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of vigilance. Every unknown number made my heart jump. Every knock on the door made me pause. And every time Mia asked about her grandparents, I answered honestly but gently, "They're not being kind right now." And I watched her absorb that, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet understanding that broke and healed me at the same time. Then, on the fourth day, the thing I had been bracing for finally happened, and it didn't come with sirens or raised voices. It came in an envelope, thick, cream-colored, with an official logo in the corner, sitting in my mailbox like a snake pretending to be mail, and my hands actually trembled when I picked it up, because I knew, and when I opened it inside at the kitchen counter while Mia colored, I felt my breath hitch, because it was a letter from Child Protective Services, not an investigation notice, not yet, but an inquiry, informing me that a report had been made alleging emotional instability and potential neglect. And I swear time slowed down. The hum of the fridge got louder. The scratch of Mia's crayon sounded sharp, and I felt this hot, primal surge of anger so intense it scared me, because there is nothing more violating than someone trying to weaponize the system against a parent who is actually protecting their child. I crouched down so Mia wouldn't see my face, told her to keep coloring, and I went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and breathed, because panic is loud but useless. And then I stood up, looked at myself in the mirror, and said out loud, "Okay, you wanted war, because this was it. This was the line they crossed that you cannot uncross." I called my lawyer immediately, read her the letter word for word, and she was calm in that way professionals get when they've seen this movie before. "This is common in family disputes," she said, "especially when money is involved." And I almost laughed, because of course it is, and she continued, "Do you have documentation?" And I said, "I have everything." And she said, "Good. Do not contact them. Do not confront them. Let the process happen." And then she said something that stuck in my bones. People who make false reports often underestimate how much their own behavior becomes visible in the process. And that sentence felt like a match being lit in a dark room. When the CPS worker called 2 days later, I answered calmly, because there is nothing more disarming to a fishing expedition than composure, and she introduced herself, explained there had been a concern raised, and asked if she could schedule a home visit, and I said, "Of course." And then I did something my younger self never would have done. I asked, "Can you tell me who made the report?" And she said gently, "I can't disclose that." And I said, "I understand, because I already knew." And when she came, she didn't find chaos or neglect or instability. She found a clean home, a child who laughed easily, a mother who answered questions without flinching, and a thick folder of documentation sitting on the table like a silent witness, screenshots of posts, records of calls to the school, the note, the financial statements, and I watched her eyebrows lift slightly as she flipped through it. Because this wasn't a story about an unfit mother, it was a story about retaliation. After she left, I locked the door, slid down against it, and let myself cry for exactly 30 seconds, not because I was weak, but because my body needed the release. And then I stood up and wiped my face and went back to making dinner, because resilience isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from my Aunt Ruth again. except this time the tone was different, hesitant. "Is everything okay?" she wrote, and I stared at it, because now the narrative was cracking, people were starting to sense that something didn't add up, and I typed back one sentence: "I'm protecting my child," and left it at that, because the truth doesn't need a paragraph. A day later, Bella tried again, a voicemail this time, her voice high and tight. "You didn't have to take it this far." And I listened to it twice because the irony was almost poetic, the person who went public first accusing me of escalation, and I deleted it without responding because silence is a boundary, not a weakness. And here's the thing I need you to sit with, because this is where the story stops being just mine. When family realizes guilt isn't working, they escalate, and when escalation fails, they either implode or retreat. But either way, the moment they involve your child, the gloves are off and the rules change. I started sleeping lighter after that. Not out of fear, but out of awareness, and every time I checked on Mia at night and saw her peaceful, I knew I was doing the right thing, even if it cost me relationships I once thought were permanent. The last message I got that week was from my father, short, no manipulation, no excuses, just "Your mother is furious," and I stared at it and thought, good, because fury is what people feel when control slips through their fingers, and control was all they ever wanted. I didn't reply. I put my phone face down and I sat with the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed but the ground is still wet, because I could feel it. The next move was coming, not from them this time, but from me, and it wasn't going to be loud or emotional, it was going to be final. And when I took it, there would be no more pretending this was a misunderstanding. It would be a reckoning. And if you've ever had to choose between being the villain in someone else's story or the hero in your child's life, you already know which one I picked, and you're going to want to see what happened when I finally made that choice irreversible. The next morning I woke up with that weird calm you only get when your heart has already had its breakdown and now your brain is in fine, we're doing the hard thing mode, and I didn't even check my phone first. I checked Mia, because after that CPS letter, after the school calls, after the smear posts, I wasn't living like a normal person anymore. I was living like someone guarding a tiny human from grown adults who had decided boundaries were a personal insult, and Mia was asleep, sprawled sideways across her bed like a starfish, one sock on, one sock missing, cheeks relaxed, mouth slightly open, and I stood there for a second and felt that protective rage turn into purpose, because they can call me dramatic, they can call me bitter, they can call me ungrateful, but they do not get to destabilize my kid and then act like I'm the one with a problem. So I made coffee, the strong kind that tastes like regret and determination, and I pulled out my folder again and I added new pages, the CPS letter, the call log screenshots, the school's email confirming someone attempted to change pickup information. And then I did the thing I had been avoiding because it makes everything real. I printed it, not because digital isn't real, but because paper hits different. Paper is what you slide across a desk and say, "This is evidence." Paper is what makes people stop smirking. And then I called my lawyer back and said, "I want to move forward." And she didn't ask me if I was sure. She said, "Okay, here's the order." And the order was simple and brutal. We document, we notify, we block access, we formalize boundaries, and we stop treating this like a family misunderstanding and start treating it like harassment. Because that's what it is when someone tries to use institutions to punish you for saying no. And then she asked the one question that made my stomach flip even though I already knew the answer. "Do your parents have a key?" And I said, "They used to." And she said, "Used to isn't a lock." And I looked at my deadbolt like it had betrayed me personally, and I realized I'd been so busy trying to keep Mia emotionally safe that I hadn't fully locked down physical safety, and that thought made me feel sick. Because the scariest part isn't what people say online. The scariest part is what they think they're entitled to do in real life. So I ordered new locks that day, not fancy ones, just solid, and I booked a locksmith for the afternoon. And while I waited, I did something else that felt like swallowing glass. I called Mia's school, asked for the principal and the office manager, and I said, "I need a safety note added to my child's file." And the office manager's voice got careful. "Is everything okay?" And I said, "No, but it will be." And I explained that no one besides me and my designated emergency person could pick Mia up. No grandparents, no family friend, no sudden "we're here to help." And then I asked for the exact procedures, the exact words, the exact steps, because when you're dealing with people who lie, you don't leave gaps. And the principal told me they'd flag her file and require ID and a code word. And I picked the code word right there on the call, something Mia could remember and a stranger couldn't guess. And then I hung up and sat at my kitchen table staring at the grain of the wood like it was a map of how my life got here. Then Mia woke up and padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, and she looked at me like she was reading my face. Kids always do, and she said, "Are we in trouble today?" And that question cracked something in me. Not because she was scared, but because she'd learned to ask it. She'd learned that adults can make you feel like you're in trouble for existing, and I crouched down and put my hands on her shoulders and I said, "Listen to me. You are not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong and you are safe." And she nodded like she wanted to believe me, but her little body was still bracing, and I could feel my anger relight because the real betrayal wasn't the note. It wasn't Hawaii. It wasn't the money. It was that my child was learning fear in her own home. And then, because I refused to let my life be only survival, I made breakfast into a tiny ritual, pancakes shaped like lopsided hearts, and Mia laughed when the first one tore, and I said, "That one is called Grandma's emotional maturity," and Mia giggled even though she didn't fully get it, and for a second it felt like air, like normal. And then my phone buzzed, and I didn't even need to look to know it was them because my phone had started feeling like a doorway they kept trying to kick in, and when I looked, it was a group text, Mom, Dad, Bella, and two numbers I didn't recognize, and the message said, "We're coming by today to talk like adults." And I stared at that sentence and thought, the audacity to say like adults after leaving a move-out note for a child, after calling CPS, after calling the school, after publicly smearing me. And then I saw the follow-up message from Bella, "Don't make this harder." And my hands went cold, because that wasn't a request, that was a threat with lipstick on it. So I forwarded the entire thread to my lawyer, and I didn't reply, because every reply is a rope they pull you with. And then I texted my neighbor, Mrs. Klein, who lives across the hall, the retired woman who knows everything and fears no one, and I said, "If you see my parents, don't let them in." And she replied, "Honey, I was born ready." And I laughed out loud for the first time in days. Because sometimes the universe sends you a guardian angel in orthopedic shoes. And then the locksmith arrived, a big guy with kind eyes who didn't ask questions, and I watched him swap the locks with the precision of someone who does this all day, and every click felt like my nervous system unclenching a notch. And then he handed me the new keys, and I held them like they were a trophy because to some people a lock is just a lock, but to me it was a boundary made metal. And then, because I'm not stupid and I've learned patterns, I installed a simple door camera, nothing dramatic, just enough to know who's outside before I open because after betrayal, the gift you give yourself is information. Around noon, my lawyer called and said, "They may escalate when they realize you're not folding." And I said, "They already did." And she said, "No, I mean they may try to corner you in person or use a third party." And I swear as she said it, my phone rang with an unknown number and I didn't answer, and then it rang again and I didn't answer, and then a voicemail popped up and I listened, and it was Aunt Ruth, voice trembling in that fake concern way. "Jessica, please call your mother. She's beside herself. She says you're keeping Mia from them. This is breaking the family apart." And I felt my jaw tighten because that's how they do it. They recruit flying monkeys. They outsource guilt. They spread a version of the story where you're the monster for setting limits. And I wanted to scream, but instead I texted Ruth one sentence. "They involved my child's school and CPS. Do not contact me about this again." And I blocked her. And that felt like ripping off a bandage that had been stuck for years. And then Mia asked if we could go to the park, and I almost said no out of fear. And then I caught myself, because fear is how they win. Fear is how you shrink your life until all that's left is avoidance, and I refused, so we went and I walked her to the swings and I pushed her gently and I watched her hair lift in the wind, and I told myself, this is the point. This is why I'm doing the ugly paperwork and the locks and the rules, so my kid can be a kid. And then my phone buzzed again and I ignored it, and then my door camera sent a notification and my stomach dropped because the feed showed my parents in the hallway outside my apartment and Bella beside them, and behind Bella was a woman I didn't recognize holding a clipboard, and I knew in my bones what that was before I even thought it, a witness, a mediator. Someone to make them look reasonable, and me look unstable, if I reacted emotionally. They knocked once, then twice. Then my mother leaned toward the door and said in that loud voice people use when they want neighbors to hear, "Jessica, we just want to see our granddaughter." And I stood in my living room staring at the screen, feeling my pulse in my throat, and Mia looked up from her coloring book and said, "Who is it?" And I forced my voice calm. "Nobody you need to worry about." And I walked her to her room, turned on her favorite show, and told her to stay there, and then I came back to the door, and I didn't open it, I spoke through it. Loud enough to be clear, not loud enough to be messy. "You are not welcome here, leave." And my mother gasped like I'd slapped her. "How can you speak to me like that?" And I said, "You tried to have me investigated to punish me. You don't get access to my home." And then Bella snapped, "Stop being psycho." And I felt something in me go ice cold, because calling a woman psycho is the oldest trick in the book when you want to discredit her boundaries. And I said, "This is being recorded." And the woman with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably, because suddenly this wasn't a cozy family intervention, it was evidence. And then my father tried the soft voice, the one meant to sound like reason. "Jess, please, this is unnecessary. We're here to resolve it." And I said, "Resolve what? Your consequences?" And my mother said, "We made one mistake." And I said, "You made a chain of choices." And she said, "You're exaggerating." And I said, "You involved my child's school." And then she went quiet for a half second, the way people do when you say the part out loud that they hoped would stay hidden. And then Bella tried the last weapon, the one she thinks is a magic spell. "We're family." And I said, "Family is not a permission slip." And I swear the hallway went silent for a beat, like even the air was listening. And then my mother hissed, "Open the door." And I said, "No." And then the woman with the clipboard cleared her throat and said, "Jessica, my name is Dr. Hayden. I'm a family counselor. Your mother asked me to come facilitate a conversation." And I almost laughed, because of course they would drag a therapist into it like a prop. And I said, "If you are a licensed counselor, you should know coercion is not therapy." And there was a pause, and she said quietly, "You're right." And my mother snapped at her, "Don't take her side." And that's when I knew this wasn't about healing, it was about control, because real healing doesn't require an audience and an ambush. And then, because I wanted no confusion, I said clearly, "You are not allowed to contact Mia. You are not allowed to come to my home. You are not allowed to interfere with my work or her school. Any further contact will go through my attorney." And my mother's voice rose into that shrill disbelief. "You can't do this." And I said, "Watch me." And then I heard a neighbor's door open, and Mrs. Klein's voice floated down the hall like a judge entering court. "Is there a problem here?" And my mother instantly softened. "Oh, hello, we're just family." And Mrs. Klein said, "Family doesn't loiter." And I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing, because karma sometimes wears a cardigan. And then my father said the quiet sentence meant to stab, "You're going to regret this." And I said, "I regret letting you teach my daughter that love is conditional." And my voice shook only on the last word, because that was the truth that hurt. And then there was a silence that felt like a door finally closing in my chest, and they walked away, and Bella looked back once, eyes hard, and I watched them disappear down the hallway. And my hands started shaking after. Not during, because adrenaline is polite like that. It waits until you're safe. I went into Mia's room, sat beside her, and she looked at me carefully and said, "Was that Grandma?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Is she mad?" And I took a breath and said, "She's upset because she doesn't like the rules, but the rules keep us safe." And Mia nodded slowly, like she was filing that away in her little brain as a life lesson. And then she said, "Do we have rules for everybody?" And I smiled sadly and said, "Yes, even family." And she said, "Good." Like it was obvious, like she understood fairness better than the adults who raised me. And that should have been the end of it, right? The confrontation, the boundary, the dramatic hallway scene, the neighbor cameo, the little victory. But the truth is, people like my mother don't retreat quietly when they lose access. They look for a new door. And I didn't know it yet, but while they were standing outside my apartment pretending to be concerned grandparents, something else was already moving in the background. Something that would hit my inbox that night and change the whole game. Because the next escalation wasn't going to be emotional, it was going to be financial, official, and designed to scare me into submission. And when I opened it, I realized they weren't just trying to get access to my daughter, they were trying to drag me back into the role I'd finally escaped, and this time, the trap had paperwork attached. That night I put Mia to bed early, because she looked exhausted in that quiet way kids get when adults dump chaos near them, and I stayed in the doorway a little longer than usual, just watching her chest rise and fall, and I told myself, whatever happens next, she will not pay for my family sickness. And then I walked back into the living room with the kind of careful steps you take when you're trying not to wake up your own anger. And my phone was sitting face down on the table, like it was sulking, and I flipped it over and saw 3 new emails and 2 missed calls from unknown. and my stomach did that slow roll again because after the hallway stunt, I knew they weren't done. They never stop when you finally say no. They just changed the weapon. The first email was from my bank with a subject line that looked harmless until it wasn't. Important update regarding your account. And I opened it expecting the usual boring security reminder, but instead it was an alert that an attempt had been made to access my account from a new device, and not just access, an attempt to reset credentials, and they listed the time and the general location. And the time matched the exact window when my parents were outside my door, which means while they were performing concerned grandparent theater in the hallway, somebody was also trying to get into my money, like it was a family pantry. I felt my hands go cold, and I immediately thought, okay, either they're dumber than I fear or more coordinated than I want to believe because that timing is not coincidence, that's a plan. I didn't panic, not loudly, not outwardly, but inside my head it was like a courtroom gavel slamming down. Case closed, they're not hurt, they're hunting. I opened my laptop, logged into my bank from my secure device, changed passwords, turned on every security setting I could find, and then I called the bank's fraud line and said, I need to report an attempted takeover, and the representative's voice shifted from cheerful to sharp in 1 second, and she asked me questions like she'd heard the story before, and I answered them like I'd been training for it. Because when people weaponize entitlement, you learn to speak in facts. She asked if anyone had access to my social security number, and I laughed once, dry and humorless, because my parents are the kind of people who think they own your identity because they gave birth to you, and I said, my parents, and she said, understood, in a tone that told me she absolutely understood. She put a note on the account, set extra verification, and told me to monitor my credit, and then I sat there staring at my screen thinking about how insane it is that your own parents can smile in your face and pick your pocket at the same time. I checked the next email, and my jaw actually tightened so hard it hurt because it was from Bella's university portal. Not a payment notice, not a balance update, but an automated message that said, a change has been requested to the authorized payer and emergency contact information. And my first thought was, how are they still touching this? And then my second thought was, oh, they're trying to replace me on the account so they can pretend I was never the one paying, so they can tell the story later like I did nothing, like I was always just a leech, because narcissists don't just want money. They want the narrative. I logged in, and sure enough there were pending changes, and I could see names being added, my mother's email, my father's number, and an address I recognized, their house, and I felt that hot rush crawl at my chest, because this wasn't just them scrambling to cover tuition. This was them trying to erase the paper trail that proved I was the one carrying Bella's future. I took screenshots of every page, every pending change, every timestamp, and then I hit deny, and the system asked for confirmation, and I clicked yes with a calm that scared me, because by this point the betrayal had burned off my hesitation and left pure clarity behind. And then I got the third email, the one that made me physically sit back like someone shoved me, because it was from a mortgage servicing company, subject line, refinance application received, and I hadn't applied for anything and my name was on it, my full legal name, and for a second my brain tried to reject it like spam, but it wasn't spam, it had my correct information, the last 4 digits of the loan, the property address, their house, and the request was listed as urgent due to payment increase, and I swear to you my first thought wasn't anger. It was the stunned, disgusted laugh in my head like, wow, they really think my signature is a family resource, like my identity is communal property. I opened the email fully, and there it was, the line that turned my blood into ice. Co-borrower signature required to proceed, which means they were trying to initiate the refinance and force me to respond, because they know a lot of people will sign something just to make the problem stop, and they were banking on me being the old version of me, the version who panics and patches and rescues. I didn't even call them. I called my lawyer because I'm done playing family telephone with people who turn every conversation into manipulation. My lawyer answered and said, tell me what you're looking at, and I read the email out loud and there was a pause, and then she said, okay, this is serious, and I said, I know, and she said, do not sign anything, do not respond to them directly, we're going to contact the mortgage company and put a fraud alert on the file, and I said, I want to rip my name off that house, and she said, we'll talk options. And then she asked something that made my stomach clench again. Have you ever signed anything without reading because they told you it was just paperwork? And I didn't even need to think. I said, yes. And she said, that's how this starts. And I sat there staring at my kitchen wall, remembering every time my mother pushed a document across a table with a smile like she was doing me a favor, and every time my father said, "It's nothing, just sign." And I remembered the way they always made me feel guilty for hesitating, like caution was disrespect. Then my lawyer said, "Look at the sender domain, verify it's a real servicer, and forward it to me." And I did, and then she said, "Also run your credit reports tonight." And when she said that, my throat went tight because the fact that it was even necessary felt like a violation. I ran my credit and my hands were shaking as I typed, and I kept thinking, what kind of parents put their kid in a position where she has to check if her identity is being used like a credit card? And then I saw it, a hard inquiry recent from a lender I didn't recognize, and my heart sank because that means they tried to move something, not just talk about it, not just threaten it, they made moves. I took screenshots, saved PDFs, and I froze my credit across all bureaus, and the process took longer than it should because everything in life takes longer when you're doing it with rage in your chest. And at one point the system asked me security questions like, "Which of these addresses have you lived at?" And my parents' address popped up, and I stared at it like it was a snake. Because even the systems designed to protect you assume your family is safe, and sometimes they're the threat. After I froze everything, I sat in silence for a minute and listened to my apartment, the hum of the fridge, the faint cartoon noises from Mia's room, and I realized something that hit me harder than any insult they'd ever thrown. They weren't trying to talk. They were trying to trap me legally, financially, permanently, because if they could keep my name tied to their debt, they could keep a leash on me forever. And if they could paint me as the villain publicly, they could pressure me. Socially too, and that's when I understood the full shape of their game. It wasn't just favoritism and cruelty. It was control through obligation, control through paperwork, control through shame, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. So I made another folder, a physical one, and I labeled it in thick black marker like I was naming an enemy, financial harassment, and I put the bank alert, the mortgage email, the credit inquiry, and the university screenshots inside. And then I wrote a timeline on a notepad, times, dates, calls, visits, attempts, because if you ever end up in front of a judge, you don't win with feelings, you win with receipts. And right then I want you to pause and tell me something because I need the comment section on fire for this. If your family ever tried to tie you to their debt, their bills, their mess, and then called it love, what would you do? Would you cut them off completely, or would you try to negotiate? Because I'm telling you, negotiation with people like this is just a slower version of surrender. Then I got a text, not from my mother, not from Bella, from my father, and it was the calmest text he's ever sent in his life, which is how I knew it was calculated. "Jess, we need to handle the refinance tomorrow, call me." And I stared at that line, and I could literally hear his voice in my head, the same voice that told me to be reasonable while I was bleeding out emotionally for years. And my thoughts got ugly for a second, the juicy neurotic thoughts, like I imagined calling him and letting him talk and talk and talk and then saying, "Sure," and showing up with a police officer and a notary and making him sign a document that set me free while his face collapsed in real time. But I didn't do that because revenge feels good for 10 seconds and then you still have to live in the fallout. And I have a kid, and my goal isn't drama, my goal is peace. So I didn't reply. I forwarded his text to my lawyer too, and then I did the most powerful, petty, peaceful thing you can do to a manipulator. I went to sleep. Not perfectly, not deeply, but I laid down, and I kept my phone on silent, and I told myself, tomorrow I move like a professional, not like a wounded child. In the morning I dropped Mia at school, and I gave the office manager our code word again, and watched her write it down like it mattered, because it does. And then I drove to my lawyer's office with my folder on the passenger seat like a shield, and as I sat in the parking lot I saw I had 8 missed calls from my mother, and 2 from Bella, and 1 voicemail from my father, and I didn't listen yet because I already knew what it would be. Panic disguised as authority. I walked into my lawyer's office, handed her the folder, and she flipped through it slowly, and she didn't look shocked. She looked ready, and she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." And when she said that, I felt something loosen in my chest, because for the first time in this whole mess, I wasn't alone in the fight. But right before we started drafting letters and making calls, her assistant walked in with a printout and said, "Jessica, this just came in." And my lawyer's eyes flicked over the page, and her expression changed, and she slid it across to me, and the header made my stomach drop straight through the floor, because it wasn't a bank alert, it wasn't a mortgage email, it was a formal notice, with my parents' names on it, and mine, and one phrase that meant they'd taken the dirtiest route possible. To force contact, petition filed, And I realized in that moment, they weren't just coming for my money anymore, they were coming for Mia. I stared at that word, petition, like it was a stain spreading across clean paper, and my lawyer's office suddenly felt too bright and too quiet, like the air itself was waiting for my reaction. And I heard myself say, out loud, "They're not serious," even though the filing stamp at the top was as serious as a coffin lid. And my lawyer didn't comfort me with fluffy words because she's not that type. She just tapped the page and said, "They're serious enough to spend money trying to scare you." And that sentence landed hard because it was exactly what it was, a scare tactic with paperwork, a weaponized family card dressed up like concern. The petition wasn't custody in the full dramatic movie sense. It was something colder and sneakier, a request for court-ordered visitation, the kind of thing people file when they want access and leverage, not love. And they wrote it like saints, like I was unstable, like I was withholding Mia out of spite, like they were heartbreakingly concerned about their grandchild's well-being. And I swear I could hear my mother's voice in every line, polished, offended, dripping with fake innocence. The same voice she used when she said, "Don't say it like that," after she did something cruel and wanted me to stop naming it. My lawyer started reading their claims out loud, and each one was a lie with a sprinkle of truth, the most dangerous kind. Jessica moved out abruptly. True. Jessica cut contact without explanation. False. Jessica is financially unstable. Hilarious because I was the stability. Jessica is preventing a loving grandparent relationship, which was the biggest joke of all because they hadn't acted like loving grandparents a day in Mia's life. They acted like Mia was a side character who should be grateful for scraps. My hands were clenched, so tight my nails left little half-moon dents in my palm, and my mind was doing that thing where it replays every moment you ignored as not that bad. Every little wince Mia had when my mother called her dramatic, every time my dad sighed like her laughter was noise pollution, and I realized why this petition felt like an ambush because it wasn't coming out of nowhere. It was coming out of entitlement that had never been challenged before. I looked at my lawyer, and I asked the question every betrayed person asks when the mask finally drops. Can they do this? And she said, they can file anything, winning is different. And then she looked me dead in the eye and said, but we treat it seriously because you don't gamble with your child. And my throat tightened because that's the line. Money is one thing, identity is one thing, but your kid is sacred ground. We went into action mode like a fire drill. And I'm going to walk you through exactly what that looks like because I wish somebody had told me sooner that revenge sometimes is not yelling. It's documentation and calm steps that make manipulators panic. Step 1. We requested copies of the filing and any affidavits attached. Step 2. She had me write a timeline from the moment Mia found the note, down to the exact words said on the phone, because court isn't moved by "they're awful." Court is moved by patterns, dates, and proof. Step 3. She told me to stop answering unknown numbers, stop responding to texts, and only communicate through counsel, because when people file petitions, they often bait you into saying something emotional so they can screenshot it and call you unstable. That day I also drove straight to Mia's school, and I asked to meet the principal and the counselor, and I brought my folder like I was walking into an audition for Most Organized Mother, and I sat down and I said, "This is uncomfortable, but I need you to take it seriously. There's a legal situation with my parents, and I need the pickup list locked down." And the counselor nodded and said, "Do you have court documents?" And I said, "We're responding now, but here is what I can provide today." And I slid across the code word form, the updated emergency contacts, and a written statement that no one besides me and my approved list can pick me up, and I watched them stamp it and file it like it mattered, and I felt my lungs finally take a full breath because at least that door was locked. Then I went home and I did the hardest part. I told Mia, but not the scary legal details. I told her in kid language. Grandma and Grandpa are making grown-up trouble, and it's my job to keep you safe, so if anyone besides me or your teacher says they're picking you up, you say no and you tell your teacher. And Mia's eyes got wide and she said, "Are they mad at me?" And that question hit me like a punch because kids always think it's their fault, and I knelt down and I held her little shoulders and I said, "No, baby, never you. This is about adults not knowing how to act right." And then she whispered, "Like when I found the paper." And I said, "Yes, exactly like that." And her mouth trembled, and I hated them for putting that tremble in my child. That night, My phone exploded, but now the messages had shifted from angry to syrupy, and if you've lived through this, you know exactly what I mean. It was, "We're worried. Let's not involve outsiders. Family should handle family," which is code for, "We want our power back." My mother left a voicemail that started with sobs and ended with a threat. "Jessica, please, you're tearing this family apart. I don't understand why you're doing this. We just want to see our granddaughter. And if you keep acting like this, we'll have no choice but to let the court decide." As if I hadn't already seen the filing, as if she wasn't the one who lit the match and then screamed about smoke. Bella texted me, "You're ruining everything for everyone, you always do," and I read that line 3 times because it was the perfect summary of their family religion. When Bella suffers, it's a tragedy. When I suffer, it's my personality. And then my dad texted, "Please don't do this." And I almost replied, I almost sent the one sentence that would have broken him. "You did this." But I didn't. I just forwarded it to my lawyer, and I put my phone down, and I made Mia macaroni like life was normal, because the best revenge is not letting them steal your peace hour by hour. The court date was scheduled faster than I expected, because petitions like this move quickly at first, and my lawyer explained it like this: "They want to catch you off balance." And I thought, too late. I've been training for off balance since childhood. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a plain outfit. Nothing flashy, hair pulled back, minimal jewelry, not because I was trying to perform innocence, but because I refused to give them any angle. And when I walked into the courthouse hallway and saw my parents sitting there with Bella, I felt the old reflex in my body, the reflex to shrink, to apologize, to smooth it over. And then I saw my mother's face when she noticed me. And it wasn't love, it was calculation, like she was measuring whether the judge would believe her tears, and that reflex snapped clean in half. My lawyer squeezed my elbow lightly, grounding me, and my mother stood up and did the performance. "Jessica, honey," like we were in a grocery store, not a courthouse, and she reached for Mia's photo on my phone, I guess because she didn't have access to the real child anymore, and she said, "We just miss her." And my lawyer stepped between us like a wall and said, "No direct contact." And my mother's eyes narrowed for half a second before she pasted on a smile again, and I thought, there it is. The mask slip. Inside the courtroom, their attorney spoke first and painted me like a bitter daughter punishing grandparents, and he used all the buzz phrases: best interest, family bond, sudden alienation. And I sat there watching him talk about my child like she was a shared resource, and my brain kept flashing back to the note on the table. "Please move out by the time we're back." And I wanted to stand up and say, "Does that sound like love?" But my lawyer had warned me, "Let them talk, we answer with evidence." So I stayed still. Then it was our turn, and my lawyer didn't attack them emotionally. She attacked them structurally. She laid out the timeline, the move-out note accessible to a 7-year-old, the financial exploitation, the attempted account access, the refinance bait, and then she introduced the school documentation showing I had legitimate safety concerns, and the judge's face changed. Not dramatic, but enough. His eyes lifted a little. The way they do when the story stops sounding like family drama and starts sounding like control. The judge asked my mother a direct question. "Why did you leave a note instructing the mother and child to move out?" And my mother started with, "We didn't mean for the child to see it." And the judge said, "But she did." And my mother's mouth tightened, and she tried the next excuse. "We thought it would motivate Jessica to be independent." And the judge said, "On Christmas." And that's when Bella couldn't help herself. She muttered, loud enough to be heard, "She's 31. And the judge turned his head slowly and said, "That's not relevant to the child's emotional safety." And I swear to you, I almost smiled because for the first time, an authority figure wasn't buying their framing. The judge asked my father if they had contributed financially to Mia's needs or maintained consistent caregiving, and my father stumbled, because the truth is they hadn't. Their care was occasional babysitting with complaints attached. And then the judge asked something that made my stomach flip. "Do you acknowledge the note caused distress?" And my mother hesitated too long, and in that hesitation you could see the real issue. She didn't regret the act. She regretted the consequence. After a short recess, the judge issued a temporary order, no forced visitation at this time, and a requirement that if they wanted to pursue any future contact, it would have to be through a supervised setting and only after mediation and proof of stable, appropriate behavior. And my mother's face went pale because she didn't want a relationship. She wanted control without accountability, and supervision means witnesses. And manipulators hate witnesses. We walked out, and my father called my name softly, Jess, and I turned, not because I owed him, but because I wanted to see if there was a human left in him, and he said, "We're parents," and I said, "And you forgot what that means." And then I turned away, because that was the cleanest sentence I had. When we got home, Mia was doing homework at the table, and she looked up and said, "Are we okay?" And I said, "Yes, baby, we're okay." And she nodded like her whole body unclenched. Now here's the moral lesson you can take to your own life, because I don't want this to just be entertainment. I want it to be useful. If someone's love comes with paperwork pressure, guilt, deadlines, and threats of outsiders, that's not love. That's leverage, and leverage is not a family value. It's a control tactic, and the second lesson is this: being the bigger person does not mean letting people keep harming you. It means making the decision that ends the harm even if they call you selfish for it. Bella ended up taking a leave from school that semester. Not because I ruined her life, because the system finally demanded she stand on her own feet, and my parents ended up selling the house a year later, and I only know that because a neighbor told Lauren and Lauren told me, and I sat there with my coffee and felt nothing but a quiet relief that my signature wasn't tied to that sinking ship anymore. And the wild part is, a few months after the hearing, my mother sent a card with a picture of a sunset on it and wrote, "I hope we can move past this. No apology, no accountability. Just the expectation that time should erase what truth exposed," and I didn't respond, because moving past something requires the person who caused it to stop doing it. Mia is 9 now, and she sleeps through the night, and she laughs loud without checking if it annoys anyone, and sometimes she'll say, out of nowhere, "Mom, I'm glad it's just us," and I'll feel that sting behind my eyes, because that's the kind of sentence that comes from a kid who learned too young that some adults are unsafe. And if you're watching and you've got a child, hear me clearly. Your first job is not to keep the peace with your parents. Your first job is to keep your child safe, emotionally and physically. And if the price of peace is your child's nervous system, it's too expensive. Now I want your honest opinion, because I know this comment section is going to split like a lightning bolt. Did my parents cross a line the second they left that note, or the second they tried to drag me into court for access? And if you were me, would you ever allow supervised visits later, or would you keep the door shut forever? Tell me what you would do and why. And if you've lived something like this, drop the word boundaries, so people who feel alone can find your comment and realize they're not crazy. And listen, if this story hit you in the chest, the next video you need to watch is the one where the family doesn't just weaponize paperwork, they weaponize reputation. They run to relatives, church friends, social media, the whole town, and they try to turn you into the villain to force you back into obedience. Because if you think a move-out note is cruel, wait until you see what people do when you stop being useful and start being free.